Today, we are building picture frames. This video is a complete walkthrough providing tips and different ways to accomplish each step with the tools you already have in your shop.
Formats and sizes. You can keep it simple with traditional sizes, 4x6, 5x7, and 8x10. They're easy to ship and do not require much material. Picture frames do require quite a few measurements. Essentially, there are 4 sides to each frame plus the back, so you have an overall width, height, and depth measurement. Also, consider your border thickness, meaning the thickness that you're ripping your boards down to initially. I'm not going to overcomplicate this video by going in depth on borders. Just note that if you are going to sell custom frames professionally, this measurement matters. Otherwise, if you're just making picture frames to sell on Etsy, it doesn't matter as much. Now, let's look at the individual pieces. Each of the 4 sides has an outside, inside, and rabbet measurement. The rabbet is important because it needs to fit your glass and artwork. There is an equation for this, but just note that if you're using the jigs provided today, you don't really lean too heavily on it. This helpful website lists a bunch of different standard size frame options, both in inches and metric, and it dives into panoramic frames, square frames, and what an A-size frame is. It means that the longer side is equal to 2 of the shorter sides. Tools. Picture frames do not require a ton of specialty tools. I had actually built this entire picture frame only using the table saw, some wood glue, and some blue tape. Now, that being said, I did purchase 3 things for this video today. I had bought 2 of these clamps, which can be used to glue up and clamp together larger projects. They also just work for picture frames, so kind of a dual purpose. And I had purchased this dual point driver, which works a lot like a staple gun to shoot the little tags into your rabbets, just to hold down the glass and your back plate inside the picture frame. It's just a little more fancy than other options I'll go over later. I do go over a couple different ways to build a complete picture frame using your table saw, miter saw, and a router. The only thing you might not own is a flush cut saw. I use that when I cut the splines. And once you own one, you'll see that you use it a lot more than you thought that you would have. Cutting. Rip your material down to its desired thickness, also known as the border measurement. You can do a really thin one, really thick one. Doesn't matter. It's completely up to you. Rabbets. It's simplest to cut the rabbets when you have a long straight piece of material to work with rather than cutting them down to size and then adding the rabbet afterwards, because it gets your hand toes closer to the big fast spinny parts. Rabbets can either be cut with the table saw or a router. At the table saw, it's easier if your rabbet's depth and width are the same. Set your blade height using a combination square. And guys, when you're cutting these rabbets on the table saw, just be mindful that your fence measurement does not take into account the blade thickness or blade kerf. So if I'd set my fence over to 1/4 of an inch to measure out and get 1/4 of an inch off, you can kind of see that it's actually going to be measuring between the blade and the fence. And what I need it to do is incorporate that blade kerf as well, which is generally about 1/8 of an inch. So you actually want to bump your fence down a little bit more. Otherwise, you're going to be taking off too much material. And then you're going to go ahead and bump your fence over and run the blade at this direction just to avoid any kickback. You can also cut rabbets using a router, handheld with a flush cut bit and that little guide attachment, or you can set it up in the router table. They also make a rabbeting blade, which I didn't know I owned until afterwards. The router table and table saw gave me much cleaner cuts than the handheld router, mainly because you have more control over the pieces. And honestly, the router did not do a bad job until the very end when I was actually making my very last pass. The router bit did not move. I don't know if this had split out or how it got to the depth that it had, but it really janked this piece up. The other 3 pieces look perfect. I don't know. Profiles can be simple or intricate, and it is easier to cut profiles just like the rabbets while you have longer stock pieces. You can cut a gentle angle on the table saw. You do this by setting your table saw angle to 10 or 15 degrees and running your board upright in there to make that cut. I really hate doing those cuts, so there will be no demonstration of that today. I like my hand toes. There is no imaginable number of router bit combinations that you can do on the outside and inside for your picture frames. Start out with a cheap set of router bits and begin replacing the ones that you use more often with nicer, more professional bits down the road. Get jiggy with it. By creating a simple jig, you can achieve repeatable and accurate cuts. Whichever saw you are going to be using, it's best to just take a few pieces of scrap and throw together a jig so that way all of your pieces are the exact same size. It's very important for picture frames. Soon when I open up this door, I won't see birch plywood anymore, because I'm gonna make 6,000 frames. I'll be covering jigs for both the TableSaw and MiterSaw, and then also the Spline Jig for reinforcement. To use the TableSaw Jig, you'll simply clamp your board onto the left side, make your first 45-degree cut, and then set your measurement on the right side, put your board on that right side, clamp it into place, make your second 45-degree cut, and then repeat that process for all sides of your picture frame. I did not come up with this jig, and I'm not going to steal the credit from David over at Make Something. It is perfectly square, and all of your cuts are calculated from the inside photo measurements. This is one heck of a masterpiece. There's a link in the description so you guys can go watch that video with him after you finish this video. I did not purchase his plans. They're $5. It's not over the top, but they're not free plans. The MiterSaw Jig works kind of in the same ways, and we can actually build this one together in the shop. First, I measured my MiterSaw fence and ripped a board down to 3 inches. Since this piece of scrap was 20 inches long, I drew a line at 11 inches. This will make sense later. Then I realigned the back and drew a line all the way around it, so that way I knew that my mounting screws were going to be away from where the saw blade would be going through the jig. You can either use a few Kreg screws through the back or countersink some drywall screws into the bottom. So I came over here to show you guys how to cut this line, but then it turns out that this is going to actually hit my fence, so that's no good. I ended up drawing some lines on it. I was going to just go ahead and trim it all off, but then I noticed it's literally 1/8 of an inch, so I'm just going to go ahead and just rip it down on the table saw, so it's about 1/4 of an inch shorter. Then I avoid the issue altogether. Just know this might be an issue for you. And it takes care of the fact that this piece looked really janky anyway. Most miter saws have holes in the fence. I used 2 1-inch screws with 2 washers just to make sure that it wasn't going to pierce through my 3/4 inch jig. You do not have to line up your pencil lines with the saw blade at this point, just as long as they are close. On the opposite side, I'm just using a clamp because there are no holes on the left side of my miter saw fence. And since I'm not cutting all the way through my jig, this will do just fine. This jig works much like the TableSaw Jig I showed you earlier. It uses the measurement of your rabbet for the picture frame size and does not depend on your actual border thickness. So if you had a thicker piece or a thinner piece, it does not matter. Also, does not matter how thick or thin your rabbet is. So if you have a thinner rabbet or a thicker rabbet, this jig doesn't give a hoot. To set this up, all that you're going to go ahead and do is take your combination squares blade, set it to 0 on this side of your saw blade mark, and then mark your common dimensions, being 4-inch, 5-inch, 6, 7, 8, and 10-inch. This is a 20-inch long jig. It's just a scrap piece of wood, so I could show you guys how to build it since I have my big fancy jig I had built. So if you had actually made it a little bit longer, then you would have actually been able to fit that 10-inch measurement. By moving your saw blade down, you do eliminate some of the space to keep everything square. So I would not take any off of this side. I would just go ahead and build the jig a little bit larger, even if it's not centered, just so you have more of your measurement sides. Another thing to note is when I mark these, I'm going to go ahead and mark them at 4 1/16, 5 1/16, 6 1/16, 7 1/16. You get it. So that way I have room in there for my glass and my artwork to move around a little bit. I don't want it to be super snug. Once those lines are marked, you're going to take the other part of your combination square, not really sure what it's called, and you are going to line it up so that it is perfectly aligned with that actual piece, and then draw your line parallel to your saw blade cut. So that one will be 4 1/16, and then I will have my 5 1/16, and that is why you will cut your saw blade before you start doing these measurements, just so that way everything is on par. To use this jig, the first thing you would do is actually flip your rabbet down, cut your very first line to 45, flip him over so the rabbet is exposed, and then line your inside rabbet measurement up with a line, not the inside border measurement. So this one here, inside rabbet, that'd be 4 1/16. That would be 5 1/16, and I'd actually cut this one to 5 1/8, and it is almost perfect with my jig lined up. Then you would just go ahead, hold that down, make your cut, and then cut a second one. And that is true for any piece. Cut your first initial 45, flip him over, and then line up that rabbet measurement so that way it is perfect. And that is how you would get your perfect measurement of 5 inches on the inside with the jig. Pretty cool. And to remount it on the miter saw, I just go ahead and push my blade down into the jig. That way I can actually line my holes up a lot easier, and I know that everything is lined up how I want it to be. Cutting, round 2. Let's do some close-up shots of us playing with these jigs. Something else worth noting is that you guys are going to be wasting this much material per miter. Go ahead, put it in front of me. That is the equation that you're going to need to figure out how many board feet you need per picture frame. And for standard sizes, this is how much you would actually need per picture frame based off of a 2-inch wide border. It's quite a bit. But we still got 4 frames out of it. Sweet. You can throw together one of these corner jigs, but they're not actually pulling your pieces together. It's really only putting pressure downward on the 2 pieces independently. So no matter how hard I push, these 2 pieces will never get pulled together. So even if you had them perfectly aligned and then clamped them, it'll hold your glue in place while that dries, but it's not going to strengthen your joint very much. Not to mention you'd need 4 of the corner things and 8 clamps, and you're working inside of a 4x6 area. These jigs are a little better. You can save some money by building them in your shop as well. They snug up the corners and pivot to align everything. Plus, they only require 1 clamp. The simplest method to glue your picture frame is to line out some blue tape, lay your pieces on there choo-choo train style, apply your glue, and then use that tape to pull your corners together. Because this is end grain to end grain, you got to think about the wood being like little straws sucking up the glue. So I'm going to go ahead and let this dry for about a minute until it goes from a milky consistency to a clear. And then I'm going to apply some more glue just so that way our bond is a little bit stronger. If not, your wood is just going to go ahead and suck up all of that glue, and it's not going to hold your joint very tight. Line up these corners. You got to be careful not to rip the tape. I rip the tape like every time. It's still holding on there for a little bit. And there you go. Something else you'd be able to do is go ahead and fold this tape down, and then you could run some tape around the corners just to make sure that it is holding it as tight as possible if you guys don't want to buy a clamp. Now, this guy was like $10 at Harbor Freight, and weirdly enough, these are the exact same pieces on the expensive one and the not. This guy was $30. I don't know why I said expensive, but cool. Now we are just going to take our piece. I fold down these little corner pieces just so I don't have to deal with them in a minute or two. You do want the long end to be here. If not, you can't really ratchet. This is a pretty small platform for these clamps to be working on. Generally, they're clamping larger tables and things, but not a big deal. Okay, so then we just snug it up 1 or 2 little clicks, and then we make sure that everybody lines up. And there is 1 picture frame right there. Once I do have it completely glued up, I like to just bump it so it's centered in here, so that way it's not putting pressure just on the bottom and it's going to try to fan out the top or something. The minimum glue on our workbench, look at that. Bravo. And then we just repeat the steps for the other guy. Reinforcement. But gluing your frames just isn't enough. To build a lasting family heirloom, you will want to strengthen your miters, because over time, moisture, heat, and cold, and humidity, and cold, and heat, and taking them down and up, and heat and cold will eventually cause your joints to fail. But guess what? You've got options. No, sorry, nail counter, not today. A large number of joining options exist for picture frame corners to strengthen their bond to one another. Last week I posted a video on how to use and build a spline jig for your table saw, which adds these elegant little cornered decors for your picture frame corners. Splines are generally my go-to. I do like adding contrasting colors and wood types into the frames just to kind of add that. Otherwise, you would be able to do one of these numbers where you just cut a piece of dowel, use a Forstner bit, make a small recess, glue in the dowel, and once it's dried and sanded, it doesn't look too bad, but I just don't like having that on the back of my frames. You can also dowel your miters so it's hidden within the picture frame. However, I found if you don't own a specific jig to get this accomplished, even being off a 1/16 of an inch, you're going to see that at the corner and on the inside rabbet of your frame. Hardware. My number one tip for hardware is to purchase frames from Dollar Tree that have a glass pane and use that glass and the backplate from those frames. The only catch is that your borders must be the same as the frame or it won't sit on the table the same. Otherwise, you can source your glass online at most home improvement stores or at craft stores. To make your own backs, just cut a thin 1/4 inch piece of plywood or use a thicker cardstock. I see a lot of people using these dowel rods instead of traditional frame stands. To keep the backs in place, you can purchase these turn buttons like I had used on my interlocking puzzle piece picture frames, or you can pick up one of these frame tools. I bought mine at Hobby Lobby. It's like a staple gun, but it shoots those little tabs into the rabbet. Hanging options include key slot holes, sawtooth hangers, D-rings, and traditional wire. There are little cheap kits that you can buy for like $1 or $2 just to experiment and kind of play around with each of those. Hopefully picture frames seem a little easier now, and before you get started, go ahead and